Olá, boa tarde a todos. Sorry, switching to English. Good afternoon to you all. Had a little lapse there. My name is Henrique Pinto, part of the Global Center of Excellence at SAP, and we're gonna be talking about SAP HANA Cloud for the next 45 minutes. I'll try and leave some space in the end if there is any way for us to ask questions or not. But before we start, you guys are looking there at there is a NGO that SAP Brazil is sponsoring that supports families in need. It's called Desejando Bem in Portuguese. If you guys can follow that link and donate, everything and anything helps. It's for families in poverty and hunger in Brazil. So I appreciate your donations. Starting now with the presentation. So we're going to be talking about SAP HANA Cloud. I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with the term, but SAP HANA Cloud might be a very generic term, right? Because SAP has already released different versions of SAP HANA as part of the SAP Cloud Platform. But what we're going to be talking about is the next generation or the new generation of SAP HANA Cloud. It's the third generation of SAP HANA in the SAP Cloud Platform. And it's different from the previous generations because it's actually embracing some of the cloud native capabilities for the very first time. And some of these cloud native capabilities, what differentiates SAP HANA Cloud from the previous versions? Um, there are a few key uh, topics or let's say characteristics that define what a cloud database should be, right? And they are driven by different trends and challenges in the marketplace. Specifically talking about data explosion, what does that mean? The volume of data that customers are having to manage and store and process, especially more and more in terms of real-time capabilities of managing this data, right? So the business teams, they don't want to wait for a day, for a week now to be able to get information. They want to get information as fast as possible, as soon as possible, right? Also, the requirement for new types of processing data paradigms, for example, streaming, high velocity, right? So we're talking about machine learning requirements. All those new capabilities are driving new requirements for the underlying infrastructure that was not there before. And finally, also talking about new data sources. What does that mean? New components, new devices, new people, new type of applications in the cloud or on-premise, which are driving this volume of data moving forward, right? So those new sources, whether together with the data explosion and the new demands, is what's driving these new requirements and driving the need for a cloud database. And what does a cloud database mean? What is the market looking for when they are looking for a cloud database? And as was shown before, 70% of the customers today, 70 plus, they are deploying new databases in the cloud as the very first option, right? It's only if the cloud is not available, then they go for something else. But the cloud is always the first option. And why is that? What's the promise? What are customers expecting? What are the expectations of a database as a service type of offering, right? I'm sorry. So the very first one is of course the simplified provisioning process. So you don't need to go through a hardware acquisition, a hardware procurement process anymore. You can just spin up a new instance of the database anytime you need, right? And also you can spin it down. So you're not attached to a huge upfront capital expense investment anymore. you are actually paying for that instance as operation expenses and only for the time you need it. After you are done with it, you can just turn it off and you're not going to spend any time, any money on it anymore. So there is no depreciation along 5, 10 years to be able to leverage that resource. You can do it in a matter of minutes or hours if you need it for that long, or you can leave it running 24/7 for weeks, months, or even years. So all types of use cases are now possible with this. In the past, if you had a need for a database that was ephemeral, let's say, oh, I need to test a scenario, but I just need to test this for a few days. Nobody would invest or approve an investment for acquisition of hardware and resources to instantiate a database for a few days. So that's why people had to rely on centralized, huge instances, and everybody was sharing the same instance, and that would drive other limitations in terms of scalability, right? But anyways, that's the provisioning part. The second part is because of that provisioning process, and like I mentioned, we're not talking about capital expenses anymore, but now it's operational expenses. We have consumption-based pricing. So you're only paying for what you need, or sorry, only paying for what you use, right? You're not paying for extra. You're not paying for upfront resources anymore. The third one is elasticity. What does that mean? It means that you can start small and grow or shrink after the need for the growth is gone. You can really adapt the size of your instance of your database to your actual needs. And we understand needs fluctuate in time. But back in time, before on the on-premise world, everybody, if you had a database that you were instantiating, or any other type of application, the key part of the process was sizing because you had to understand the peak load you're going to have to handle, and everything was sized based on that peak load because it's not easy to scale up and down. On the cloud, you don't need to anymore because you can scale so dynamically. You don't need to size for your peak load anymore. You actually size for your basal load, and when you know you're going to have a peak coming, you can grow it. And after the peak workload is gone, you can shrink it down again. Okay, so this together with the consumption-based pricing, the fact that you're not paying upfront costs anymore, this is really key to why customers are embracing this. Okay, and the last but not least is also the fact that database as a service is a platform as a service offering and not just infrastructure as a service. What does that mean? It means that the management of the database, which is typically very, let's say, resource intensive, in terms of administrators, in terms of the processes you need to manage, like backup and restore, right? You need to manage the backups for a long time. You need to make sure that the databases are integral. I mean, you need to make sure that the replication between the primary and secondary systems and tertiary systems, in case you have HADR, you need to make sure that everything is up and running. And SAP in this case is guaranteeing that for you because we have a database as a service offering. In case of infrastructure as a service, this is something that the customers would need to manage themselves. And now they are really outsourcing the management and only focusing on the development of the application logic and code. And everything else is handled by the provider of the database as a service. On the next slide, we see. I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of SAP in terms of HANA, but also in terms of HANA in the cloud. So 10 years ago, and for those who don't know, HANA turned 10 years old this year, right? So HANA was first released in 2010, in April 2010, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, it was a beta release. It was not general availability yet, which came a little later in 2010. But HANA was first released as a beta format in 2010 or ramp up, as we used to call back in the day, right? And for a while, the only thing we were able to do with HANA was analytical scenarios, right? Because there was no application that was supported on HANA back then. And then in 2012, we had the very first application, SAP application, that was migrated to support HANA, which was BW on HANA. And then 2013, we had Suite on HANA as well. So that's the first wave of application adoption that we saw, which was the migration to HANA wave, as you see there on the left-hand side. A little later, in 2015, we had the very first application that was quote unquote made for HANA. What does that mean? It means that we're talking about applications that were really developed uh, uh, to support or to leverage the benefits of HANA as a database, right? Or as a platform, rather, right? Because HANA, in addition to the database capabilities, also has a lot of platform level or application layer type of capabilities, right? The in database engines like Graph, Geospatial, Predictive. I'm not going to talk about that now, but there's a lot of capabilities that HANA has under the table. And the applications at SAP at that point were started to be developed to leverage those additional capabilities and not just treat it as yet another database. So that's the made for HANA generation. So the first one was S4 HANA. Then we had BW for HANA in 2016 as well, right? And that's the second wave you see there. However, the same year we released S4HANA, we also had the first release of SAP HANA as a managed cloud service, which was what we call today SAP HANA Neo, right? Neo actually, for those of you who have been around for a while, it comes from NetWeaver on demand, right? Which was the very first, let's say, cloud venture of SAP. I think Neo or NetWeaver Cloud or NetWeaver On Demand started around 2012, 2013. And HANA was originally released as a service within the context of that Neo framework, which eventually came to be the SAP Cloud Platform. Or rather, HANA Cloud Platform first, and then SAP Cloud Platform. But that was the first version of HANA as a service in the cloud, and up to this day, a lot of customers are still using it, right? But then in 2018, we had the second generation of SAP HANA in the cloud. And what was the key difference there? Neo was based on SAP data centers, right? So it was, like I said, NetWeaver on demand or NetWeaver in the cloud, and it started as services that we hosted on our own data centers in Germany or even in the US as well. However, we perceived very quickly that, okay, this is very good to start, but we're not going to be able to keep up with the demand and the scale that the customers are requiring because we are not a data center provider, right? We were not on the same scale in terms of data center volumes as the key providers like Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure, to name a few, right? So we started SAP HANA Cloud Foundry in 2018, exactly with that in mind. We were trying to leverage now for the first time, instead of relying on our own data centers, we're going to rely on the so-called hyperscalers data centers or regions, right? So they don't have the data center concept, but rather we just talk about regions and availability zones. And now we're deploying the SAP HANA natives, or more than HANA, SAP Cloud Services as native offerings within the hyperscalers. But we, of course, make that transparent to our end customers because we are providing a full service. You don't know, you don't see that it's running on Amazon or Azure necessarily, but we use it because now we can scale at will. If instead, maybe today we have X customers, but if by next year we need to have 10X customers, we do not need to build 10 data centers. We can just leverage the underlying capabilities of the hyperscalers, right? However, we were still not fully delivering the promises that we saw in the previous slide in terms of a scalability, of the dynamic scalability of the consumption-based pricing. We still basically, even though we were providing HANA as part of the hyperscalers and could scale, we were still provisioning and operating HANA mostly as an on-premise application, but running in the cloud. And now that's the key difference of HANA Cloud, this third generation of HANA in the SAP Cloud Platform. Um, because now, for the first time, we're really truly offering a database as a service in terms of not just being able to provision or in stop start, but also pay per use, the dynamic scalability so you can grow and shrink the instance, of course, given the some constraints in terms of the data volumes that you have there, etc. And of course, there's other advantages of HANA in the cloud as well that we're going to be talking along this presentation. But now, for the first time ever, we have a true DB as a service offering that compares to other DB as a services in the market, such as Redshift or Google BigQuery or Azure Synapse, which used to be named SQL Data Warehouse. So SAP HANA Cloud, as you see here on the left-hand side on this slide, it is actually part of a broader family that we call SAP HANA Cloud Services, which was introduced by Hasselplattner in Sapphire 2019 last year. Okay. And by the way, a shout out to the Sapphire 2020. For those of you who don't know, there is no physical Sapphire this year, of course, given the COVID-19 situation and everything. But we are opening Sapphire as a free for all web virtual event. So if for those of you who are interested, you can search for Sapphire now. It's going to be open for everybody. You can just subscribe and you can watch the sessions online. Okay, but anyway, so as part of Sapphire last year, we announced SAP HANA Cloud Services, which is this family of offerings in the SAP Cloud platform that are meant to address analytical and data management needs. HANA Cloud being that basal layer where the data management happens, of course, this is the database layer, but also where we have additional capabilities such as data federation and multi-tier data management, etc. On top of that, we have SAP Data Warehouse Cloud, which is an application for data warehousing, uh, right? So a similar concept than what we have BW on-premise today, but fully scalable in the cloud. So the idea now is not necessarily to replace BW, but to be able to allow customers to leverage all the good things of BW, but in a much nicer and scalable and easier way of doing it. So a user can easily, a business user, not necessarily an IT user, but a business user can quickly consume data sources, create a join between, let's say, a spreadsheet he has and a data model he has from provision from the systems, and create a report he can then consume and distribute with his peers. And that consumption distribution is actually also attached to this because it's based on SAP Analytics Cloud or SAC, as you see here on the right, which is probably better well known by some of you because it's been in the market for a longer term. But now these three products working very closely together because Data House Cloud runs on top of HANA Cloud, so does SAC. And SAC can consume natively all the HANA Cloud objects, but also the Data House Cloud models that we create, right? So they all work together and address different needs, different use cases that the customers might have, right? But again, between those three products, we believe that we have now a full, comprehensive set of offerings to address all your needs in terms of data management and data analytics in the cloud. Right? That means that customers can now truly scale to the demand and needs that the business users have in terms of volume, but also in ease of use in the cloud and paying per use, which is even better. Okay, so if you look at the underlying capabilities of HANA Cloud, it's not very different from what you used to do on a traditional, let's say, HANA on-premise, because you have architecture slide, because you'd have the HANA Engine's capabilities that's there in the middle. I'm not going to go through too long about that. OLAP, of course, OLTP capabilities, SQL, of course, the core capabilities, but document store, graph analytics, spatial, the text search capabilities. The one thing you might be missing here that if you guys are paying attention, is the predictive engine, which was not included as the first release of HANA Cloud, but it will be there soon. It will be there by the end of this trimester, the second trimester of 2020. Right? So the predictive is going to come back there. But now we have some key differences on the left layer and the right layer as well. On the left layer, yes, HANA on-premise also used to have a virtualization capability that is built on something called Smart Data Access, for those of you who know HANA, right? But we actually took it up to the next level within HANA Cloud, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the underlying capabilities on the upcoming slides. And on the right-hand side, I think this is from this slide's perspective, the key difference of HANA compared to the previous versions. We now have a three-tier approach in terms of persisting data. And the idea here is that, I mean, a lot of customers used to say HANA is great, it addresses our problems really well. However, it's expensive. It's expensive to acquire, it's expensive to operate because it's in memory, and all our data needs to be in memory, right? So SAP has been addressing this issue for a long time now. And we released something called dynamic tiering back in 2017. And we released the second generation of dynamic tiering called NSE, or Native Storage Extension, last year with HANA 2.0 SPS 4. And NSE is also an integral part here of HANA Cloud, meaning that customers now can store data not just in memory, but also in the disk. However, we are also now introducing a new capability of HANA Cloud called the HANA Data Lake, which is leveraging the same, let's say, interfaces we used to have in the past in terms of smart data access for virtualization. But now we are managing this as a service that we provide included as part of the HANA Cloud framework, meaning the customers don't need to manage this by themselves anymore. A lot of customers try to use HANA with, let's say, Sybase IQ, for example, as a code tier data under HANA, but the burden of managing two databases, right? It takes a toll. You have to have two teams, you have to do like two operations for management, backup, restore, etc. But now with Data Lake as part of the HANA Cloud offering, this is all managed by SAP. So we have a code, a warm, and a hot stores, and they are all integral part of the service, and the customers can just activate them. They don't need to do anything else in terms of installing components. They don't need to do anything differently from a management perspective. Everything is done by SAP for you. You just consume the service. So again, this is true DB as a service, true platform as a service that we're providing out of the box. Okay, so going forward, there are some key advantages of SAP HANA Cloud that I'd like to go through. I think those four groups of advantages truly summarize the benefits and the differences between HANA Cloud and the previous versions, including the previous cloud versions and the previous on-premise versions as well. Okay, um, so bear with me a minute here. There's a little delay here between what I see and what you guys see. But the first one we're going to be talking about is that one on the left top, which means unlimited. What does unlimited mean from the context of SAP HANA Cloud? So unlimited for us has two meanings. The first one is flexibility. What does that mean? It means that if for the first time ever in the SAP HANA Cloud, we are decoupling, scaling the compute layer from the storage layer. What does that really mean? Right? So if you think about it, back in the day, HANA, not differently from other on-premise databases. If you had to grow the amount of data you wanted to store in HANA, because HANA was a 100% in memory database, you had to grow both the data storage, but also the compute layer of HANA. So if you had to grow from 1 terabyte to 2 terabytes, you had to grow everything. You couldn't just grow the amount of data that you hold and keep the same compute to keep the cost low. That was not possible because in HANA, the compute would grow together with the memory. So if you had to grow to 2 terabytes, you had to grow everything. You had to grow CPU, memory, disk, and everything else that comes with it, which was the concept of an appliance, right? And it was not different from other databases and data warehouses on premise, like, for example, Teradata and other similar ones. You had to grow everything together. Now with HANA Cloud, we're actually closer to other cloud offerings where you can really decouple that and grow them independently. We can grow the amount of data we want to store in HANA without having to grow the compute. And we can grow the compute without having to grow the data. Imagine, for example, a scenario where I have a lot of users, maybe a web application that I want to host on top of HANA, but I don't have a lot of data. Maybe the amount of data is limited. So I just need to grow compute without growing the data. Or the other way, I am growing data because time is passing by, but my compute requirements are not growing because mostly I'm still processing just the last 2 years of data. But my history is growing, and I might want to grow that amount of data that I hold for that history without having to grow compute. Now, with HANA in the cloud for the very first time, this is a possibility. Okay? So that's really different from what you used to have to in the past. Sorry, my throat is a little dry today. Okay, so the other topic in terms of unlimited that is relevant for us to talk about is elasticity. So what does elasticity means? I was actually talking about this topic before when I was talking about the consumption-based pricing. Elasticity means that you don't need to size your instance based on the peak load anymore. You don't even need to know the peak load anymore for that matter beforehand. A lot of the times we don't know that we are going to grow by 2x because we acquired a company 1 year from now, right? So let's say in the traditional world, if you were going through an acquisition process and you suddenly had to double your database size because now you have more users coming from the other side who want to look at the reports and the analytics, you basically had to buy a new hardware, do a database migration. If your supposing your hardware didn't have the capacity to double, right? So it was a very intensive and very disruptive process. So that's why customers would rather buy a machine that was 2 or 3x what they needed at that time, just to avoid having to go through this process of migrating on a rush. Right, so they would buy a machine that was 2 or 3 or sometimes even 5 times the capacity that they actually needed at that given time, so that they could survive with the same infrastructure for 3, 5 plus years. Right, because again, migrating was such a hard process that they wanted to avoid it at all costs. Now, with the cloud capability of HANA Cloud, we do not need to go through that process necessarily anymore because we can grow elastically on the fly. What does that mean? That suppose, for example, that you start with a 256 GB instance and you need now to grow to 512 because you have more data, you have more users, you went through an acquisition, or just because another department that now is looking at the finance department using HANA, maybe the supply chain department is saying, hey, I like that HANA thing, let me use it as well. And now you need to grow the amount of data that you can hold, right? HANA Cloud can do this on the fly. So you can go and change that, the size of the instance on the fly on a hot. So there is no disruption. The instance doesn't need to be stopped or anything. In the past, if you wanted to go through this similar process, you had to open a ticket for SAP. It would take like a few days for someone to even look at a ticket, then plan the process, see which data centers had that capability, etc. This could take a few days, maybe even weeks. Now this is something that's done in a matter of minutes, and your database is never offline. So everything is done online, right? So this is, of course, we are not infinite in capacity. There's a max limit that we can support today. So as part of the initial release of HANA Cloud, we are bound now at 1 TB. But we are going to increase that to 4 TB, and this is just from the memory standpoint. It's not data, right? So again, because of the data lake I was just talking about, this is different because now we are limited at 1 TB of memory and 72 CPUs, if I'm not mistaken, for 1 TB. But the amount of data can actually grow up to 90 terabytes if we leverage the data lake. Because again, the compute and data storage are independent, and we can leverage that layer of the data lake. So we can hold up to 90 terabytes there. But the in-memory piece of HANA, so the amount of data that you're going to hold in memory is going to be limited to 1 TB. Or rather, less than that, because we have to have some work area as well. So let's say 512 gigabytes now. We're going to be growing that memory space to 4 TB very soon. Very soon means the next trimester, okay, next quarter. And then we're going to go up to 4 terabytes. And then after that, by 2021, we're also going to have this support for scale out. So we're going to grow even beyond 4 terabytes. Okay, but right now, again, we understand that 4 terabytes or 1 terabyte today, 4 terabytes soon, does not limit the amount of data you can hold. It just limits the amount of data you can hold in memory. But because HANA now can hold data in different tiers, that does not mean that you can't process more data that is either stored in the disk warm store or on the data lake cold store. Okay, now we have this flexibility. Okay, so the next topic on that list that you see on the left side, the last topic would be trusted. And what does trusted mean from the concept of HANA? I think I chose one aspect of this. It can have different meanings, but I chose one which is the one source of the truth, right? So, because one problem that a lot of companies have with analytics and creating instances, and especially in the cloud, because it's so easy to create an instance, this problem is actually multiplied by 10 or even more, which is it's very easy for different organizations to create their own databases in their own data houses. And now they start to load data on their own ones, right? We used to call this data marts in the traditional data warehousing space. So everybody's creating their own physical data marts. What does that mean? Now it means that the reports that the accounting team is taking from their data mart might be different from the reports the finance team is taking from their data mart, and which might be different from the reports that the sales teams are taking from their data mart. Because everybody has their own cloud data marts, it's so easy to create, right? You just go on Azure or Amazon, create a database, boom, that's it, right? Um, this does not change with HANA Cloud. So with HANA on-premise back in the day, we introduced this concept of a virtual data warehouse or a logical data warehouse where data is physically only persisted once, right? And you can virtually access data because it's in memory. You can virtually access at a very good performance. So you don't need to replicate data all over anymore to access on a good performance. So you can have one single physical layer, create what we call virtual models or calculation views in HANA terminology. And you can have a calculation view for finance, a calculation view for accounting, a calculation view for sales, but they all connect to the same underlying database and the same underlying tables. So if you have an update that is done from sales, it's reflected automatically on the finance and accounting reports. Or if you have finance doing a financial adjustment or accounting doing an accounting adjustments, it's also automatically reflected in everybody else's reports because we have one single physical layer now that is reflected through virtual models. HANA Cloud has the same concept, right? And even more, even broader, because now we can virtualize additional sources of data, not just the underlying on-premise sources that we had back in the day, but now if you had like a cloud data lake or a cloud data house, so data lakes are all the rage these days, right? All the underlying capabilities of virtualizing data lakes and virtualizing cloud data houses, and of course, virtualizing traditional databases and applications, it's all embedded within HANA Cloud. Right? So we now can even bring that concept of a virtual data warehousing or a logical data warehousing that HANA introduced 10 years ago. We can bring that to the cloud, enabling this virtual data warehousing scenario in much more, in many more scenarios, right? So that's where we're coming from this trusted perspective because we believe that concept of a single source of truth is even more important now in the cloud because it's so easy for everybody to create their own data marts. We need to make sure that we understand the implications when we do that and make sure there is a proper alternative on how to do that in an efficient way. Okay, the next topic is simple, right? And this slide might actually start as a complex because you think about it. Oh, now HANA has three different tiers, and how am I going to decide which data to put where? Right? We have in memory, we have in disk, we have the data lake, and we can even leverage the cloud data lake, like I just mentioned. We can leverage like S3 if you're on Amazon, Azure data lake if you are on Azure, right? As a data store that we can access through HANA. But why is this easier, right? So again, I'm also showing some capabilities which are not necessarily there today as of the first HANA Cloud version, but I'm also showing the vision of what we want to build with HANA Cloud, right? And from a simplification perspective, the first point was trying to reach a cost-efficient deployment option, which was not possible in the past when HANA was 100% in memory. So from that perspective, we're simpler or we're cheaper or more cost efficient now with HANA in the cloud because now we allow customers to be able to deploy a lot more data with the same amount or the same instance sizes they used to have in the past, right? So you don't need to grow your memory to 20 terabytes to be able to process 20 terabytes of data. You can leave data on that data lake layer or you can leave data in the disk and leverage HANA in the memory just for the parts that make sense. However, this is still mostly an effort that needs to be managed by the customers and the users today. A HANA administrator needs to decide what goes in which layer, right? So very soon, and we have a public HANA roadmap that you can just search for the new cloud roadmaps from SAP. I can also provide the link later if desired. But SAP now has a public open roadmap for all its cloud products, and HANA Cloud is not different. But we have in the roadmap plan still for this year an automated option where the data is going to be automatically decided by HANA based on the statistics, in the usage statistics, in which layer it should go. Of course, we can make a suggestion, or you can decide to trust HANA, and HANA is going to make the changes for you automatically. But then now HANA is going to be capable of making that this tiering decision in an automated way. That's what we mean by simplification. It's getting that burden out of the customer's hands, right? Letting HANA handle it for you. Right, so now that's what we truly believe where dynamic tiering is going to be possible, right? Because now we're not talking just about being able to tier data, but to tier data in an automated way, right? Again, it's not there as of the first version of HANA Cloud, but it's in the roadmap. It's going to be there very soon. Okay. So last but not least, talking about openness, again, I could talk about this from different angles, and I chose one angle, which is the capability of being multi-cloud. What does that mean? Multi-cloud means that, let's say you as a company, you are today leveraging Amazon as your main cloud. And like I said, if you decide to leverage HANA Cloud, you you don't need to know where we are deploying it. However, if you have other applications already running on Amazon, let's say your ECC is on Amazon, your BW is on Amazon, and you'd like to have HANA Cloud connected as quickly as possible and as close as possible to those applications to reduce latency and allow better results from a response time perspective, typically customers would like to know, okay, so I want to deploy my HANA Cloud on Amazon, even though it's transparent for me, but I want it to be closer for my other Amazon applications, or Azure or Google, right? It doesn't make a difference. But you might have one strategy. However, strategies change. You might start with Amazon today and say by next year you might decide to go to Azure, or you might decide to go to Google. Or you might be on premise today and decide to go to the cloud in a couple of years, right? So with HANA, and that includes both HANA on-premise and HANA in the cloud, we can actually now bridge that multi-cloud hybrid barrier because the same HANA, the same projects, the same capabilities that you develop on one cloud or on-premise are applicable to any of the other environments. So if you start on Amazon today, and you decide to migrate to the Google Cloud next year or to Azure next year, or if you start to Azure and decide, or you decide to go start on premise, decide to go to Amazon next year, everything that you build on HANA, if you're leveraging the best practices in terms of leveraging the Web IDE as your modeling layer, leveraging XSA as your runtime layer, etc., and using HANA HDI containers for your database developments, everything is leverageable on the other clouds. So we are truly open from a multi-cloud standpoint, meaning that we are not gonna block you from being able to migrate your content from one to the other. It's not like if you start on Amazon, you're stuck with Amazon forever, and if you need to migrate to another one, you need to start from scratch. By no means, that's not the idea. The idea is that definitely that you can choose where to be and make it transparent. Or you can even have multiple HANAs on different instances on different clouds. And also the hybrid scenario where you start with HANA on-premise and then you start HANA in the cloud. It does not mean that you're going to turn off your HANA on-premise on day one. It's probably going to be something that you're going to be need to coexist for a while. And also the stuff that you have on HANA on-premise in terms of the data, but also the projects, etc. Again, you can migrate easily from your on-premise to your cloud HANA's instances. You can bring the data, bring the content, right? In a very easy way. Of course, this does the one caveat or the parenthesis I was going to make here is from previous generations of HANA Cloud going forward. So if you are on HANA Cloud Neo or HANA Cloud Foundry, as we talked about before, there is a process because those guys were not necessarily based on XSA yet. There is a process to migrate the content, especially the database content that was leveraging the XS Classic engine. So, right, so it's not trivial to migrate. So there is a process to do there. But anything that you are doing today that should be leveraging the again the web IDE and the new best practices of developing HANA is translatable easily to HANA Cloud, no matter which cloud you decide to deploy it to. Okay. So now I'd like to actually comment about four scenarios or four deployment use cases for HANA, and out of the most common one that we have seen. And we're actually almost running out of time, so I'm going to try to be quicker here. Um, so the first one is the hybrid development or the hybrid deployment, like you were talking about. You're not going to necessarily get out of your on-premise world from day one. If you start a cloud adoption process, it's probably going to be a phased approach and something that you're going to coexist between cloud and on-premise for a while in what we call the hybrid approach, right? So you're going to have your on-premise assets, your HANA, your BW, your ECC, etc., and you're going to start to leverage more of the cloud stuff, whether it's SAP HANA Cloud, but maybe also other stuff on the cloud, like, for example, an S3 data lake or a Hadoop instance on Azure or whatever, right? So all those capabilities need to be able to be consumable through this analytical platform that you're developing now. So HANA has the capability of leveraging data from in a real-time way or a virtualized way from all these sources, right? And enable this data to be consumable by SAC, by SAC, by Data House Cloud for customers to create their own custom models, for users to create their own custom models, or for any other third-party application that decide to connect to HANA, right? We can leverage all those on-premise and cloud assets together in creating this, let's say, hybrid virtual data model or hybrid virtual data warehousing in the cloud. Okay, that's extending the virtual data warehousing concept that we had on-premise to the next level by including all those cloud capabilities. Okay, another typical scenario that we see when deploying HANA is the data lake. What does that mean? And now we are looking for a cheaper, more cost-efficient way of storing a lot of data. So, for example, a very common scenario is a customer who is decommissioning an older ECC instance, or maybe they are migrating from 10 older ECC instances into a newer S4. However, they are doing a greenfield approach, and they don't want to necessarily bring all the history from the old ECC instances into S4. Even if it's a brown field approach, and they are going to bring some, they might not want to bring everything. You might have 20 plus years of history on the other instances, and while you might still need that data for reporting purposes, let's say for legal reasons, etc., you don't need to have that data in ECC for operational purposes. Your operation is not going to need data from 20 years ago. Maybe the master data, but that's going to go there anyways. But the transactional data from 20 years ago, you might not even need transactional data from 5 years ago. Sure, you might need it for analytical purposes. If you want to look at the history for any tax-related reasons, for example, you might need 10 years of data. Or if you are starting a machine learning project, you might want to have 10 plus years worth of history so you can properly train your models to be able to do machine learning, right? But from an operation standpoint, that data doesn't need to go into your new S4 instance, right? So you might want to have a way to store that data in a cost-efficient way, But it's not something that you're going to do use on a daily basis. You're not going to use that 20-year-old sales order data on a daily basis. You're going to use it maybe once a year, maybe not even that, or maybe doing a project where you're doing machine learning, but that's it. So the data lake provides the very cost-efficient way that can grow very efficient, very large. Like I said, today it's up to 90 terabytes. Very soon we're going to be able to go much beyond that. We're talking about 500 terabytes in the short to medium term. Okay, and the idea is to have a petabyte scale data warehouse, right? So you can really go up to like petabyte volumes of data, right? So you can store a lot of data, but it's still stored online. So this is not traditional archiving. You're not going to archiving data out of ECC. You're really getting data out of ECC into a new system where you're going to be able to access it for analytics or anything else. Maybe in 10 years, maybe next year you decide, hey, maybe that data that I stored into HANA, I need that for some process that I didn't think about. And now I need to load this into my S4 instance. It's possible, it's there. You just consume it, it's online. You consume it and you need to maybe create some ABAP code or logic to import the data, but the data is physically available and online, right? So that's the key value of the data lake is providing a cost-efficient way to store data that is might not be very valuable or whose value you don't know yet, but you can store it there for analytical or transactional purposes for a very long time if you need. Okay. The next scenario that I'd like to talk about, and I'll wait a little bit for these slides to change. So the next scenario is what we call the multimodal scenario. What does that mean? So I was talking about the HANA engines before, right? And this is also a scenario that was relatively common in the on-premise world. If you're trying to develop if you're trying to develop a database, if you're trying to develop an application that is just doing like BI type of analytics, sure, HANA is very quick, it's very fast, it's going to provide a lot of capabilities that other databases can't, but you're not really leveraging all the capabilities that HANA can offer, right? So the scenarios or the applications where HANA truly shine is when we are actually showing the underlying capabilities of the platform that nobody else can do. So, for example, if you're doing a geospatial map-based application where you need to do some forecasting on the fly. Oh, based on this map based on the area that I'm marking on the map, I want to forecast how much my sales is gonna go. Let's say, oh, I want to touch this area of the map. What's this going to impact on my sales forecast? Or maybe I do not want to touch this area of the map. How is that going to impact my forecast? So now we're talking about the spatial and predictive. But imagine, for example, you're analyzing relationship between customers from a marketing scenario, that's graph analysis, and you're trying to understand how this would impact your future, let's say, churn. That's also predictive, but we're now combining two of those engines, right? So whenever we have an application or a scenario, a use case that combine two or more of those engines together, this is something that only HANA can do. Because if you're gonna develop something similar out there, like say on Amazon or Azure, you're gonna need to have two, three, four different services to do the same thing that HANA does. Right? So this is again a very unique capability of HANA, and especially those use cases where these type of applications are required. This is something nobody else can do on a, as efficiently as we can. Like I said, if you're going to do something similar with this, with the traditional data warehousing, sorry, the traditional application capabilities out there, you're going to need to probably have one graph database like Neo4j. You're gonna have to have like a spatial database. You might be using Oracle or another one. You might need to, if you need a document store, you're gonna probably gonna be using like MongoDB or something. If you're gonna do predictive, you're probably gonna use some Python on top of R or Spark, right? So putting that all together into one single platform and allowing customers to create applications that can truly perform on top of this, that's very unique to HANA as well. And again, not different from what you used to have as a value proposition on HANA on-premise, but we have that unique capability in the cloud as well, and we can because it's in the cloud and it can provision instances much faster and much easier. It's really let's say even more important for customers to be able to leverage those capabilities. The last scenario I'd like to talk about, and I mentioned the virtualization before, is, of course, virtualization. And I'd like to, and again, this is not new with HANA Cloud. The virtualization concept, like I mentioned before, is something that we introduced with HANA On-premise, probably as old as 9 years ago or 8 years ago. When was SDA created? I think HANA 1.0 SPS4. And the virtualization has been one of the key aspects of HANA since like I said, since those early days of HANA. But why we are mentioning it here in the context of HANA Cloud? First, because yes, it's important, and especially if you go to the cloud, like I was mentioning the hybrid scenario. If you're in the cloud, virtualizing other cloud sources is even more important, right? Because now you have even more capabilities, you have more data sources spread out, and it's even more important to be able to consume them. Sorry. Um, But on top of that, SAP actually took the virtualization capabilities that we have with Smart Data Access to the next level. What does that mean? It means that uh, so traditionally, the one challenge that a lot of customers had with virtualization was the following. Sure, we understand virtualization is very important. It's very good because you don't need to replicate it in everything. But from a performance standpoint, it has a toll. It might be a problem because it might be slow, and you also might be impacting the source database. Let's say it's your application database, and now you're running a lot of queries, virtualizing all those queries to the application database. It might have an impact on the application layer, right? So customers would say, when I decide that virtualization is not good anymore, then I need to now persist the data. How do I do this? Right? I mean, how do I decide what's good to virtualize, what's good to replicate? And what's the middle ground there? How do I do this in a more efficient way? And there was no good answer. Basically, the answer was if you need to drop your virtualized table and you need to create a persisted table, unfortunately, you're gonna have to create that from scratch. If you drop a table and you have HANA objects on top, like calculation views, etc., all those objects were gonna be lost. You'd have to recreate your calculation view from scratch. I mean, there were ways to try and minimize there that you could create your new table without dropping the old one, and then the calculation view you need to go and modify, but there was still effort. Right, there is still a lot of effort in managing the changes from an application standpoint. Also, if it's not an analytical scenario, but it's a transactional scenario, and you're dropping one table and creating another table, from the application standpoint, the application code logic, you also need to handle that. So it was not transparent to the applications and the calculation views that you're doing this, right? So there was an effort in changing that. So it was almost not worth it to go through the change because the effort was so high. But now with HANA Cloud, we have this new capability called the replica table. So actually, we can start as a virtual table, and now on the fly, you can say, okay, so virtualization is not working anymore. I want to replicate, and it's a flag. You go and do change the table configurations, the table definitions, outer table, and now the table starts to be replicated. Of course, the configurations, the underlying configurations for the replication to happen already needed to be there, but the table was a virtualized table that you change to a replication table, and now on the fly, HANA starts to replicate the data in real time. Of course, there's an initial load and then the real-time replication, and now the data is persisted in HANA available for the applications. And maybe you might say, okay, now this table is not required so frequently anymore. I want to go back to a virtual table. Again, done. It's a configuration. So that uh, change, that hybridization capability between virtual and physical is something that's new to HANA Cloud. And again, 100% transparent to the application layer. Your calculations views don't see the change, your applications don't see the change. It's just going to be faster because now it's persistent, right? Because we're not changing the table, the metadata definition of the table. We're not changing the table name, the data types, anything. We're just changing how HANA manages the underlying data, whether it's going to the underlying database to access it or if it's persisted locally, right? Again, it's an added capability on the virtualization that we introduced with HANA on-premise that really brings the capabilities of virtualization to the next level in making it even easier for customers to leverage the virtualization framework of HANA in the cloud. Okay. Um, so with that, I actually conclude my presentation. I hope it was uh, um, helpful for you guys to understand the differences between HANA Cloud and the previously existing versions of HANA, namely HANA on-premise and the other HANA Cloud offerings, including HANA Neo and HANA Cloud Foundry. But again, the four key points of differentiation being the elastic scale, the consumption-based pricing, so flexible consumption. It's fully managed by SAP, so this is database as a service. You don't need to have a DBA or an admin anymore on your end. And it's multi-cloud. You can deploy this on any cloud you want, or even on-premise on the SAP data centers, right? And you can migrate between one to the other, and with all the flexibility that that entails. Um, so these are the key differentiation points. There is much more capabilities. And also another key change is that now HANA is going to be cloud first, meaning that all the new features of HANA, they're going to go to the cloud first. And then there is going to be a decision, especially for the key innovations, they might still make to their on-premise, but that's not going to be guaranteed. Right, so the cloud version is going to be really the, let's say, the innovation facing version of HANA. And if a customer is looking at developing a new application, innovative application, innovative cloud data warehousing, etc., we're going to recommend HANA Cloud as the go-to solution. HANA on-premise is still going to exist. We're going to have 2.0 SPS5 released in a couple months in June. We already have a plan for the next version, whether it's going to be 2.0 SPS6 or 3.0 as some people are speculating. I don't know that yet, but we definitely are going to have more versions on premise. But again, on premise is going to be now seen more as the version that's going to support the existing on premise applications, and the innovations are going to happen more in the cloud. Okay. I hope that with this presentation was helpful for those of you watching this, either online or on demand later. My name is Henrique. My LinkedIn profile, you see the QR code there on the left-hand side, the top one. That's my profile. You can look me up. You can ask questions. Send me an email. I'm available. I'm a very approachable guy. Appreciate for those of you who are here. Appreciate those of you who are watching this on demand. And be in touch. Thank you very much. Okay, let's see the questions here in the chat.